Some foods are deadly. We all know this. That's why we don't pick random mushrooms from the forest and eat them, and it's why we don't munch on random herb-looking grass in a field when we don't know what it is, because it might not be safe. But what about the food in your local grocery store? And what about food you pay a hefty price for at a restaurant? We trust those foods, right? Well, so did this man in Galveston, Texas. But it wasn't only him. The same thing happened to a man in St. Louis, Missouri, and also to people in New York, Connecticut, and New Jersey. These people didn't all eat in the same restaurant, but they ate the same food: raw oysters. Raw oysters are a delicacy consumed all around the world. France is the largest producer of oysters in Europe. China is responsible for 85% of the world's farmed oysters, but they eat almost all of the harvested oysters that they produce themselves. In the United States, oysters are harvested along the East Coast, West Coast, and Gulf Coast. Oysters are considered raw shellfish. Anytime you eat raw food, you have to be prepared for the risks associated with consuming raw food, which mostly means food poisoning. But how often do we actually get food poisoning from eating raw shellfish, or from hollandaise sauce made with raw eggs, or a rare cut of meat? Really not that often. So these people, when they ordered raw oysters, obviously didn't expect to get sick. So what happened? Raw oysters, when not cared for properly, can transmit the vibrio vulnificus bacteria, which is a bacteria actually related to vibrio cholera, the bacteria that causes cholera. Vibrio vulnificus bacteria live in coastal waters where oysters also live. Because oysters feed by filtering water, vibrio and other harmful germs can become concentrated in an oyster's tissues. Eating raw or undercooked oysters can become a huge health hazard if you are eating oysters that come from a vibrio-infested area. Unfortunately, an oyster that contains vibrio doesn't look, smell, or even taste different from any other oyster. Luckily, vibrio can be killed by cooking oysters appropriately, but that doesn't help you at all if you love the oysters raw. So let's say you go to a restaurant and eat a raw oyster containing the vibrio vulnificus bacteria. What will happen? Well, most people with the vibrio vulnificus infection experience a mild illness, including diarrhea and vomiting, but others will get very sick, and 1 out of 5 people with a vibrio vulnificus infection will die. This deadly bacteria can lead to a severe illness causing infection in the bloodstream, also known as sepsis, severe skin blistering, and infection requiring amputation of the legs or arms. Anyone can get vibriosis, but some people are more susceptible to severe illness. People with liver disease, cancer, immunosuppression are more likely to have severe side effects, but so are those who have had stomach surgery and those who take medication to lower stomach acid levels. If you fit any of these criteria, it's definitely better to skip the raw oysters and also stay out of vibrio-infested waters, because vibrio vulnificus can also enter the body through a cut or skin scrape. So if you like to fish or swim in brackish or salt water, you could also be exposed this way. Vibrio vulnificus is often what you hear called a flesh-eating bacteria. It starts off as a cellulitis, which is an inflammation and redness of the skin, and severe tenderness in the affected area, which can progress to blisters or black spots on the skin, fluid-leaking wounds, and gangrene, which is death of the affected tissue that can spread very rapidly. This is definitely a medical emergency. Now let's get back to those people we were discussing earlier. That guy in Galveston, he was in his 30s and started getting sick 2 days after eating raw oysters at a local restaurant. He had underlying health conditions that were not specified by the authorities. He was in the hospital by the 3rd day after eating the oysters and passed away within a few days. The man in St. Louis, Missouri was 54 years old and got sick after eating raw oysters from a seafood stand called the Fruit Stand and Seafood. He bought the oysters on a Tuesday in June and started feeling bad the next day. By the 2nd day, he was in such severe pain that the ambulance was called and he was taken to St. Clair Hospital in Fenton, Missouri. Once at the hospital, his condition deteriorated rapidly, and he passed away 2 days after having eaten the contaminated oysters. Across the country in the New York area, 3 people died this summer and a 4th was hospitalized after contracting the vibrio vulnificus bacteria. One of the New York area deaths was in Suffolk County on Long Island. This person actually contracted the bacteria through water exposure. It's unclear to authorities whether the individual contracted the bacteria in local waters or from somewhere else. In the 2 cases of people in Connecticut that passed away, there were both found to have open cuts and contracted the bacteria in water of the Long Island Sound. The third New York area man that was hospitalized but later released contracted the bacteria from raw oysters that were eaten in Connecticut. After so many breakouts of vibrio in Connecticut, that state actually now tests oysters for the presence of vibrio and monitors levels. In addition, they've established safe harvest standards, which most states should implement, which includes rapid cooling of oysters in high-risk areas. So these harvested oysters are immediately placed in an ice slurry, which drops the internal temperature to less than 50 degrees Fahrenheit within 3 hours of harvest. And although they have 3 hours to reach this temperature, the process usually takes less than 20 minutes. In lower risk areas, harvesters are required to refrigerate or ice all oysters within 5 hours of harvest. Under this plan, oysters must be less than 50 degrees Fahrenheit within 5 hours of refrigeration and icing. Now, all harvesters are required to shade oysters while on the vessel. Steps like these, along with cooking raw oysters, will keep the consumption of oysters as safe as possible, but the safest way to eat an oyster is always to have a fully cooked one. Now, as always, stay healthy and thanks for watching.